So, welcome everyone. For those of you who are just joining, I'm in Christchurch, where it's been frosty and cold this morning. I biked up the hill this morning to try and watch the sun coming out of the sea, out of the Port Hills, but unfortunately there was too much cloud just on that eastern horizon, which is a bit irritating, but never mind. But it was cold, frost. Was there a frost up in the Sunshine Coast, Chris?
No frost over here today, but it's definitely definitely the New Zealand team are getting acclimatized now and showing up wearing jackets when it's 15 degrees in the morning now. So I think all the Kiwi crew over here are fully converted to the Sunshine Coast life now.
Well, what do you guys call a cold morning on the Sunshine Coast? What's cold?
15.
15.
12 to 15.
I had a friend who lived in Cairns for a while, and one morning I think the temperature dropped to 12 degrees or something, and they asked David, "How much colder is it when it snows?" They actually they thought it was close to the snow was about to come down at that stage.
That's exactly how it feels over here, and it's nice to see all the Kiwi crew wearing their jackets coming to work in the morning now.
There we go. Well, it's past 11 o'clock, and I think we'll get underway. Welcome everybody. I'm Roger Sutton. I'm part of the Deta team here in Christchurch, and today we've got a webinar thinking about the decarbonisation challenges in rural communities. Most of us live in urban places. We live in places where most of the population is, but a lot of our energy is used in places that are not so urban. We work in places that are distant from big centres, places where resources might be not as plentiful. And today we've got a couple of the Deta team talking about some of their experiences and challenges from that. So we've got Chris Laurie, who's based up in the Sunshine Coast. Chris is an old-time engineer, chemical engineer. He's worked in energy for about 10 years or so. Chris?
Yep.
Bunch of other experiences in the recycling world, a bunch of other industrial experiences as well. And then along the corridor for me, we've got David Taylor. And David is going to give us a wave. And David's an old energy guy as well, another chemical engineer.
Mechanical, actually.
Mechanical, sorry.
Yeah.
Been with Deta pretty much since the start, and has had, I think, 23 years experience as a real engineer. So the order we're going to run today is we're going to have Chris chatting about a big project he's been deeply involved in Victoria, working for the Victorian Health Building Authority. He's going to chat for about 5 minutes about that. And then David's going to talk about some of his experiences in New Zealand with a bit of some of the reflections he's got. We're going to do a bit of backwards and forwards with a few other questions, and then we're going to open it up. People can then using the system can then send us questions, and I can then pass those questions on to Chris and David. So maybe we'll get underway. Maybe Chris, you want to launch up with your 5 minutes on your experiences working in Victoria, rural Victoria. Welcome, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. Appreciate the introduction. So today, and as you guys might notice, I've been working in Australia for a long time, but I'm originally a Kiwi, so hopefully, I've got a bit of experience on both sides working in New Zealand and Australia. But the project I'm talking about today is a project we've been working on in Australia for the last over 6 months with the Victorian Health Building Authority, or VHBA, looking at energy efficiency and solar in rural hospitals. So this is the summary of the project. So there's actually VHBA has actually got a website summarizing the project and going through all the different aspects of what they're working on. But what it is the Victorian government's supported the rural hospitals with $40 million to invest in energy efficiency and solar. And so we've been working with them across that. So Deta was awarded 2 regions within Victoria. So the Grampians region, which covered 84 hospitals, aged care facilities and accommodation. blocks, and then also the Hume region, which was 44 hospitals, aged care and accommodation facilities. So stage one was doing an energy audit and going through and identifying all the opportunities. Stage two is actually project delivery and measurement and verification. And so that's actually where the rubber meets the road and us actually going out and implementing these opportunities. So the key findings we've had so far was that the biggest impacts can be had in HVAC, so heating, ventilation and air conditioning, hydraulics, which is your domestic hot water and your heating hot water, and solar. So I was just going to run through some of those examples now. So with HVAC, the largest thing that we found was a lot of these smaller hospitals had been designed based on very centralized systems, which you would find within large metro hospitals. And what that means is that you find that large wings that only operate maybe Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, are being air conditioned when they don't need to be, when there's no one there. That might be a GP clinic that operates a few days a week, or it might be an administration wing. But they're being air conditioned because the emergency and acute wings are operating 24/7, and there's no ability to shut them down or to operate them independently. And so what that means is one of the biggest things we've found is that if we can decentralize HVAC and just heat and cool the areas that we need to, then massive savings, like up to 40% energy savings on the HVAC by decentralizing. And the other side is also separating out the ventilation from the heating and cooling was another big win as well. So that was one big aspect that we found. Another one was the domestic hot water and heating hot water. So converting from quite old natural gas and LPG boilers, which operate at efficiencies of anywhere from 60 to 80% efficient, converting them over to heat pumps. So domestic hot water heat pumps and heating hot water heat pumps, which can operate with efficiencies between 300 and 400%. So COPs of 3 to 4, depending on the duties and temperatures. And then the last one, as it says in the title of the actual grant or the funding, was solar was a big aspect. So solar and batteries, we found a significant amount of solar throughout the audits that we did. So over 2,500 kilowatt hour potential of solar is already installed across these facilities. So that's predominantly rooftop solar, but there's also some car park solar as well at a couple of facilities. And then batteries as well. So I think, solar stacks up really, really well in Australia, partly because of, how much, solar radiation we get over here, but also because of the grants and funding that both the state and the federal government offer for solar, which, means that the payback periods are, really attractive, like in the 5 to 6 year payback periods for solar. Which is really, really impressive. So we identified opportunities to increase the solar by an additional 3,500 kilowatt hours of potential generation across the region, which is, more than doubling what they've currently got. In terms of key observations that we noticed while being on site and while speaking with a lot of the site managers and facility engineers out in these regional locations is that they face a lot of challenges that maybe you don't experience if you operate a metro hospital in Melbourne, or if you're operating a manufacturing plant in Sydney or things like that. So the key thing that we realized was resilience is critical for a lot of these facilities. These hospitals are quite often the largest employer in town. They're also quite often the fallback position of last resort if there is a natural disaster happening in the community. If there's a bushfire, if there's flooding, if there's anything major happening, they are the last refuge for a lot of the community. And so therefore, thinking about resilience is really critical. And so what we found on site was that a lot of the facilities have diesel generators and natural gas, and they import electricity from the grid. Now we're adding to that resilience by adding in solar and batteries as well. So hopefully increasing their resilience. And I don't think that it should be necessarily viewed as a one versus the other. It's a in addition. And so thinking about how we integrate the solar and batteries into their existing networks to ensure when they do have major outages that all can be used and utilized. One thing that we came across, which we didn't anticipate initially, was a lot of the government programs in Australia offer funding for degasification or for moving away from fossil fuels. So if we were going to convert a domestic hot water system from natural gas to a heat pump, the government will offer funding for that, but only if we remove the fossil fuel asset, so the fossil fuel boiler or the fossil fuel hot water cylinder. But then if we remove that asset, even if that asset's only sitting there as a backup, if we remove that asset, it decreases the resilience. So we have to weigh up whether we take the additional funding for removing the asset or whether we leave the asset in place to try and keep the resilience, even if it's only tested once every 3 months and then maybe used once every 3 years. Hospitals quite often want to have that additional resilience. Labour was another aspect. So we saw a lot of very good projects that were implemented in the last 3 to 5 years that the system was broken down. The system wasn't working. And quite often that was attributed to an out of the region contract coming in, someone coming in from Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane, doing the installation and then heading back to the capital city that they're from, and the system falling into disrepair. And so we saw across 2 hospitals just down the road from each other, one that was installed by a local contractor and it was running beautifully after 8 years of operation. The other one was installed by out of town contractor and it broke down within, a 1 or 2 years of operation. Literally same systems. The only difference is who actually did the installation. It just shows the importance of having local technical support and developing that local technical support. So whether that's working with a local HVAC contractor to do some training on heat recovery from HVAC, or whether that's working with contractors on solar thermal to ensure that they understand how it's all operating and have the spare parts and the tools and the knowledge to do the actual long-term maintenance of the system is really, really critical. And then the last point was local conditions. Quite often, the variability in these different regions, even though Victoria is one of the smaller states in Australia, being on the border of South Australia, very dry, temperatures in the winter are quite cold, and you're seeing solar thermal systems freeze and crack. In the middle of summer, you're talking temperatures well above 40 degrees, 45, 50 degrees, very low humidity. Other extreme would be on the other edge of the border. You're talking much more temperate climates up in the Alpine region, but much higher humidities. And so what technology we recommend really we have to think about where it's actually going to be going into place. And just because it's all in Victoria doesn't mean it's all going to be applicable. The other one we saw was quite often up in the Alpine regions was UV damage on equipment. So controllers sitting out in the sun and breaking down as well. So yeah, just all aspects that we need to think about when we design our systems. So just finish off and say we spend a lot of time tracking around regional Victoria, going visiting lots of different facilities, meeting with these different people, and we also got a bit of an opportunity to do a bit of sightseeing when we were out there as well. It was a great project to work on. Thank you.
Chris, it's just interesting, that whole thing about these wonderful arbitrary rules governments impose. You can only have the grant if you take the old boiler away. But in fact, the resilience story, it's like policymakers not really understanding that energy is just trilemma, isn't it? It's the price, it's the reliability, and it's the environment. And sometimes, and the dual fuel thing is really often increases reliability and resilience.
Yes, I think the key thing is that there's different ways of getting funding for different projects. If we're doing a project at a large industrial site, which is kind of more of our bread and butter, you can get funding based on the amount of emissions you reduce. So if you can leave maybe your gas boiler in place as redundancy and put in a heat pump, and you can generate carbon credits based on the amount of emissions you reduce. In these smaller hospitals, It's about actually removing the asset. And so it's a really hard trade-off to make, whether you're going to pull out the boiler or whether you're going to leave it in and forego the funding, which seems like a a decision that the hospitals maybe shouldn't have to make.
Yeah, and you've talked about they've now got like 6 megawatts of solar. You've worked with them. I added another 3.5 megawatts. Was that the number I heard correctly, Chris?
1.5 currently, and then we've identified another 3.5 to go in.
So and they set up so they're synchronizable with diesel generators. So when the big bushfire happens, they're off grid. The diesel generator starts, and the solar, that's all integrated properly, Chris.
Actually, that's actually a really hard one because they have this rule around islanding. So what it is that when there is a bushfire and the lines companies shut down their networks because of safety, what they don't actually want people's rooftop solar putting electricity back into the grid for safety reasons. And so we're looking at it now, but we're trying to work out a way where they can actually do what you're describing, Roger, where we're trying to find a solution so where they can still use their solar while they're in an emergency situation. Is there a way that we can ensure that we don't endanger people who may be working on the lines, while at the same time allowing these facilities to continue to save lives and run operating theatres and things like that?
Interesting. And the whole thing about big hot water, Chris, are they thinking about using big hot water as a form of battery, so to speak? So when the sun is shining and energy prices are low, we heat up these big tanks of hot water. Are the Australians thinking that way around that?
Yeah. So we have optimized a lot of our designs around maximizing solar during the day for making your domestic hot water for your nightly spike when people are having showers in the evenings and afternoons and things like that. And so we've done a lot of our optimization based on that, so that we're limiting the amount of solar that we're exporting to the grid, because essentially we make the assumption in most of our calculations that you don't get any money by feeding electricity back into the grid from these types of generators. So the more solar that we can utilize during the middle of the day when we probably have too much, the better, because that means we can put on larger arrays. So in the early morning and the afternoon, when the sun is not as strong, they can still supply as much electricity as possible, which is the most optimum, really.
Because what I also heard you say was, in Australia, there seems to be acceptance. If you feed electricity back into the grid from your solar, you're not going to get anything from it because they have such a big surplus of that sort of midday solar energy. While in New Zealand, if you said to anyone, look, we're not going to give you anything for your exported solar energy, people go and kind of become very, very cross very quickly.
Yeah, so I think that's going to come in a big way in tariffs. And I think if you don't think of Australia as one country, but look at it as the individual states. If anyone's really interested in that sort of thing, looking at South Australia, they're really leading the way, and their tariff structures really represent that, where they've got midday discounted electricity, where middle of the day you can run particular processes and use a lot of electricity at a very low rate when you've got huge amounts of solar. And I think that's a fantastic opportunity to build business models around. And that's things that we looked at with this regional project as well. How can we utilize electricity when we've got it, which is middle of the day with solar?
Interesting. Well, like David, I thought we might move back across the Tasman to this side. Yeah, you've been doing a lot of projects, stuff around Christchurch, but you've clearly done a whole lot of projects in rural New Zealand as well. Maybe you'd be really good just to outline some of your learnings from some of these projects you've been doing.
Thanks, Roger. Sounds good. And it's been interesting actually looking at some of our projects. It's kind of made me realise that most of our projects are really, I guess, classified as rural. I guess, as we know, a lot of the New Zealand economy is based around, the agriculture, so milk, meat, those kind of things. So, the top picture there is a milk plant in the middle of the South Island, and as you do, you put the plants close to where the farms are, which instantly removes it from the cities and from the large towns. So, a lot of New Zealand could really be classified as rural, particularly in the South Island, and that does create some interesting issues. I guess outside those primary industries more so, even things like mining. Again, they're out in the countryside. And yeah, I've done a bit of work too, I guess, in fisheries as well. So I guess they've got some factories in populated places, but fishing boats, out in the ocean, Stewart Island, Havelock, those are all kind of places which have some quite serious issues. Yeah, so I guess when I say issues, all these things can be overcome, but one of the big things really is around planning, and getting, I guess, doing that planning from quite early on in the process. And a good example was Matara Valley Milk. So yeah, they've done some great work down there around putting in New Zealand's first high pressure electric steam boiler. But when they actually built the plant, they were planning for the long haul. So they had to put a cable in from about 8 kilometres long, an electrical cable from Gore through to the plant, and they overspec the cable. So then when they came to do this large electrode boiler, which pretty much tripled the load on site, they didn't have to put a new cable in. They could upgrade the transformers at either end, and saved a lot of money. It's still an expensive project, of course, but if they had to go and lay a new cable, then that would have changed the options, quite markedly. So that planning piece really is quite key.
But it does seem to be the thing with some of these rural places that you have people on site who have been there for a long period of time, are going to be there for a long time. So that whole sort of long-term thinking in some ways often works better because they can see there's actually something which is, they think much longer term, David. Is there any comment around that?
Definitely, yeah. And I guess, I guess it's a large industry in New Zealand, but once you're in the industry, I guess there's a lot of people who stay there for their life, and they move through plants. And I guess they get to know the area, and they're aware of what's coming. And yeah, they're really, I guess, trying to make it easier for themselves in the long run, to be honest, and improve the things. And so yeah, they've got that long term view.
Is there something around getting buy-in from those people on site early on? I mean, I think, I've worked in rural New Zealand, and sometimes I see in those areas people are much more cynical about climate change and the need to decarbonise. Any reflections there but from you, David, first of all?
Yeah, no, definitely. And what has got has been changing. So definitely, when I started off, and it's been interesting, I guess, yeah, working for about 20 years in the field. When we first started, we specifically did not mention carbon, because you get kicked off these sites for being a greenie. And that was that way probably for the first 10 years or so. So really in the early 2010s, that started to change. And people, to begin with, they're all about energy efficiency and saving money, and now it's all about carbon. And that's been a really nice change in that I guess the culture of these organisations is really valuing that decarbonisation a lot more. But in saying that, there are still, I guess, pockets who, I guess it's not business as usual. It does get quite hard, but it's coming from the top down in the organisation. So whether New Zealand owned or overseas, there are mandates around. Look, you have to reduce your carbon. You have to get rid of your coal boilers. It's a much better solution to be in, and I guess these projects do get moved ahead because of that. And
Chris, sorry.
There you go.
I was going to say, Chris, have you got any reflections from Australia in terms of rural Australians being less enthusiastic about, the carbon and the climate change angle to these projects?
Yeah, I'd say it's you get polar opposites in regional Australia. I think some you get some resistance, and therefore we shift our I'd say Australia is 10 years behind New Zealand in terms of that acceptance of climate change and the need to act and things like that. But things are really accelerating as well now. But the other side is that you've also got a lot of people where bushfires are very real and front of mind, and that is, if you've lost your farm, or you've had had it on your doorstep, with bushfires on your doorstep, you generally end up with people on the other extreme where they fervently believe it and are doing everything they can. So you get both sides of it. But I think the interesting side in Australia is that maybe New Zealand's quite different, is that converting from quite often from natural gas to electricity causes an increase in emissions because of how emissions intensive the grid is currently in Australia. But the good thing with a lot of the projects we've been working on is that the VHBA, well, obviously we've got a lot of solar on site, which automatically decreases our emissions, and Victorian Health has a plan to move to 100% renewables within the next couple of years, which is also another significant improvement. So we're, as David said, we're putting in place plans now that will take advantage of, one, the grid decarbonising, plus Victorian Health also moving to 100% renewables in the coming years as well.
Chris, any comments just on working with local infrastructure providers, where they do need to go put that extra cable in or build a bigger substation? How easy has that been? Was that a key part of the success of these projects, working with those local infrastructure providers?
Yeah, I think the nice thing about the regional hospitals is that they don't use that much energy, in the grand scheme of things. When you add up 128 facilities, the combined usage across all of them was quite high. But when you look at each individual one, they're not massive energy users across the board. We're talking like 1 million kilowatt hours per facility, which is not really going to impact local infrastructure in the same way a meat processing facility or a mine or large refrigeration will impact it in the same way, like David's having to deal with an electro boiler. So nowhere near the level of impact on that side.
David, do you have any comments on how you go work with to be effective with a local lines company and that sort of stuff, getting some of these big projects?
Definitely the early engagement, and have a bit of an idea, I guess, what you're after. What is challenging, though, I guess, is different solutions around the country, whether it be electric or biomass or high temperature heat pumps or whatever it may be. So often a little bit of scoping first can be really, really useful, and then just talking to the local lines companies and your electricity retailer just to say what the issue is and what you're after. I guess a lot of organisations are trying for the one solution, which will solve all their problems, but typically that can be quite hard and expensive. And I guess a lot of these places there isn't great electricity supply there that's sufficient for what's there. But if you're going and replacing your big coal boiler, that's a massive increase. But you might be able to knock off 40% of your coal consumption without doing two major network upgrades, rather than pushing through to that 100%. So you might want to get there eventually, of course, but that doesn't stop you doing that bit first and then seeing how it lies and then progressing further. So definitely that early engagement. And I guess there are a lot of skilled people around who have done this before. So I guess largely the technology is all established. So there's people around the country who have done this. So finding out what works, what doesn't work, and going in armed with that kind of information.
Just talked a bit about the buy local stuff, David. The need to have the local contractor be part of what gets installed, so that gets maintained. Have you got reflections there?
Definitely, yeah. And as Chris said, that is the ideal solution. What we have found a bit is in these more isolated places or rural places, they've got their local maintenance crews who I guess look after the plant, but often they're not big enough to do the big capital installs. So there is a real danger that the people who maintain the plant aren't directly involved in that large capital project, and then they get left with it. So integrating them into it is a great idea. And again, they need to be able to know how it works and fix it as the case may be. There's nothing worse than having the system dumped, which either may not be ideal or there's not adequate documentation around it, and trying to maintain it and fix it and as you go through. Bearing in mind, I guess these are complex systems and there'll always be that commissioning period, and the first year probably there will be a lot of tuning, and having the skills either for external contractors who can come in or the local contractors who are able to do that, there's a real benefit.
There's another thing around the data story here. So our local communities, if it's a local hospital or some other factory that does some great decarbonisation project, that they get the data so they can actually see what they've achieved, they can see what their energy bills have done. Is there any lessons around that we can share? Chris, we start off with you there, but that data story, making sure people see what's really working.
Yeah, I think that's been a big learning from a lot of the hospitals is that a lot of them have put in these quite sophisticated building management systems. And generally, we find that there is the capability to log and track a lot of the data, and there's the capability to control their plants a lot more, like you would with the milk processing facility, where you have your SCADA system. These hospitals have essentially the same type of SCADA system, but the issue is that they don't have the skills. And so we found one region where they had the building management contractor come out every quarter and check that things are running, actually check that the air conditioners are actually functioning as they say they are on the screen. And then the same again, they produced quarterly reports that went back to management to show how they're actually improving things, or if things are declining, why they're declining, and that they need to put in more money for upgrades and things like that. So that regular tracking is really, really important. The other side is in Australia is the NABERS ratings. So all of the hospitals have what's called a NABERS rating, which looks at their energy efficiency. And every year that comes out and they're tracking their NABERS ratings and competing against each other to ensure that that they either maintain or improve their star rating. And so a lot of the motivation around doing a lot of these projects was, well, is this going to improve our NABERS ratings? Because it's a standardized benchmark across all hospitals, and it's a requirement. And so that's another way of getting that buy-in from the CEOs and plant managers.
And so, Chris, what you're also talking about is that age-old concept that if you're going to put a new fancy energy management system in, you need someone to come and tune it, check it very regularly, because otherwise what happens is Graham and Raywin come in at the weekend and change the settings, and suddenly the system is no longer running as it was originally intended.
Yeah, definitely. And I think with, a building management system at a hospital is in the order of magnitude of $250,000 to $300,000. They quite often put them in and then stop maintaining them. And you've got a very expensive asset that is, that doesn't require a huge amount of input, but, quarterly visits from the technician who runs the software, make sure it's updated, make sure that it's safe as well. When you're operating hospitals, make sure that that's safe from hacking and things like that as well, to ensure that the facilities are running well. All of those things are a key consideration for getting the most out of those very expensive piece of assets.
Chris, and David, we've got a question here. We are now getting some questions. What methods used to monitor the carbon footprint reduction post improvements? And was that part of the deliverables? First of all, you, Chris, was that part of the deliverable, trying to work out the changing the carbon footprint? Was that part of what we were doing?
But that will be part of stage 2, which is the measurement and verification step. So we've done the calculations to project if they changed from a natural gas boiler to a heat pump, then therefore we would get so much emissions reductions. And so verifying that will be a part of stage 2, which we're just about to embark upon, which is, putting in the equipment and then doing the monitoring to ensure that would be met. With solar, it's fairly easy because they have their standardized meters, so we can track exactly how much solar they have produced, how much they've used internally, and then how much they've exported to the grid. So that's very straightforward for that side. But in terms of natural gas, you can look at the bills, but you can also look at it on a boiler level, and you can look at it on a site level as well. So yeah, that is something that will come into the measurement and verification step.
David, did we have much? Are we seeing that with these rural projects? Are people actually wanting to track the lower carbon as a result?
Definitely, it's a big driver for the organisations. And with, I guess, government funding through GEDI and things, which being implemented at the moment, there's requirements around that. Say, look, we've given you this money, you need to prove what's actually been happening. And so there's definitely that side which is driving it. But often these organisations, they're spending all this money to reduce carbon, and they want to be able to say to the owners and the board, and I guess the general public saying, look, we're doing this really great stuff, and you can see what's actually happening. Some of it's easier than others. Generally, the bigger projects, say if you're getting rid of a boiler, that's quite easy to do. more integrated things into the processes can be quite hard to do those. I guess if you're making smaller changes, heat recovery, that's a lot more complex and often not quite as clear. But yeah, people are definitely interested.
Something I want to talk about, just how we share the knowledge. We're going out and we're working with the other communities. Do we at Deta have a role in the longer term of continuing to try and make sure that these fancy complex systems are actually, still running properly in 6 months, a year, and 2 years' time? Because I think, as Chris was saying, that seems to be a possible issue. How do we make sure we get all this fancy knowledge that we have into these regional places where they don't necessarily have that same exposure that we get?
Yeah, definitely. And what I've been finding is, I guess, there's lots of case studies and success stories out there, but you only hear about the positives, and which is great. But often those things that haven't quite worked well, or changes that you'd make, there's a lot more value in that as well. And it's not taking away from the project, but it really helps other people say, actually, if we're going to do this, we would do this slightly differently. So having that, less ideal kind of case study is a real benefit to it.
Chris?
I think I think one of the sides is it's not going to play so much into the regional hospitals, but other projects that we're working on, it's carbon credits becomes a big factor, and especially if you're going down the carbon credits route, there requires annual measurement and verification. So annual measurement and verification and carbon credit creation means that you need to go out and actually measure that your new heat pump is actually performing with the COP that you think that you spec'd it with, and that you are actually getting the efficiencies that you said you were, and they haven't just turned back on the gas boiler. And you ensure that things are actually running. And in those situations, that is another touch point to say, okay, well, you were expecting to use so much electricity, but using more because, things are running inefficiently, or, the commissioning didn't actually happen. So then, or didn't happen correctly. That's a really good opportunity to touch back in and to hopefully get it running as required. And I think those carbon credits provide a financial incentive to ensure that the system is actually running at its maximum efficiency.
So there are 3 or 4 themes. I've tried writing down what I think 3 or 4 things that have come through today in terms of what makes these sort of projects successful in more rural community. I write down work with the locals from the very start, buy local. So in terms of working with outside contractors, work with the other contractors who in the longer term are going to be involved. And then last one is, I wrote down, don't chase the perfect. Good that everybody buys into, and that can be implemented and maintained locally, will really always be better than the perfect system designed by some pointy head guy based in bloody Christchurch or Brisbane or Melbourne. Any reflections on that? Work with the locals from the start, buy local, and don't chase the perfect. Well, what would you guys add?
One of the things that I would say going around all these different hospitals is that looking at what the best designers in a Melbourne hospital doesn't serve you very well to go and implement stuff in a regional hospital. We actually found that that looking at what best cases in a regional application was far better solution than trying to take what's happening at as you said, the state of the art hospital in the city. It's just the scale is different and the conditions are different, and so therefore we actually found one facility that had been built very recently and had it was really beneficial going there, because what we found was that implemented all of the strategies that we thought were going to be really, really helpful, and then we could actually see their energy bills and say, yes, this is actually the best case. So using a local regional hospital as the gold standard and saying, look, and it also helps lower those barriers to saying, oh, we couldn't do that. We couldn't do that in our hospital. That's not possible. That's not practical. Having someone who's 100 k's down the road with similar patients, similar staffing and things like that, facing similar pressures, and also having those 2 CEOs of those 2 hospitals, the one that says they can't do something and the one that says they can do something, talking to each other and talking to each other in the same language, and it not being someone from Melbourne saying, you have to do this, it being someone from down the road who they trust and understand and, have that shared knowledge and shared reality. That's been so powerful.
So sometimes, Chris, that's also, if I could try and summarize that, it's about using people to sell solutions who have existing relationships with people. It's really that, if you're going to do change, start with relationships. People do change when that change is solved by someone who they already believe, trust, and have an ongoing relationship with.
Correct.
David, did you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, no, I think that list was good. I'd also say not to skimp on the early stages. So it's important to get, I guess, the data and the design done correctly. There's a few examples around of sites who, I guess, overspec things because it gets easy, but then you've got all this capacity which isn't used, and actually the project could have been implemented a lot quicker and a lot easier. And also around that data piece and the initial planning, really making a plan for the monitoring afterwards, both to make sure it's optimized and running as you expect, but also so you can verify it. So there's nothing more frustrating than getting to the end of a project and there's not the data there to actually do the proper monitoring and verification. That happens quite a lot.
Oh, but what about learning lessons from things when they go wrong? Someone's asked a question on that. That whole thing about the more we share our lessons with these people in regional places, the fact that projects that haven't gone well for these reasons, back to that honesty thing in relationships.
Most definitely, it's really important, and I guess it's human nature to try and that didn't work so well, we're going to keep it to ourselves. But sharing it is really, really good. And I guess one of the good things about the size of the market in New Zealand, there's not too many players. So, there's the same contractors keep popping up all the time, the same designers and those kind of things. So, word does spread, and it's not like there's, hundreds of companies that have to move through. It's, more of a handful where these things have to be said.
I mean, I think another question here is, we've talked quite a lot today about how business used to think about energy efficiency and saving money, but now it's much more about the carbon story. Do we think government organisations will soon have financial incentives like carbon credits coming soon?
Quite likely, I guess. And whether that's I guess, looking at the carbon neutral, government program around those kind of things, like there will be penalties coming in for carbon emissions. It'll be interesting to see how that all pans out, though, and on the industrial side. So, I mean, in the past, it's more been around, I guess, the upfront capital to help progress these projects. Whether that, that's not really looking like it's continuing. It may well be around legislation to say, look, you must meet these targets, or maybe through levers, just, having the ETS price increasing. I guess the big thing is we really don't know at the moment, and it's still a wait and see kind of situation.
Yeah, and from the Australian perspective, the interesting thing to note is that, we do have some stable carbon credits in the form of the federal carbon credits, but a lot of the state ones, they actually cycle through them quite quickly, where they'll give incentives for particular things. So it might have been 5 years ago, it might have been LED lighting. That's almost gone now. And there is some funding for LED lighting, but it doesn't have as much emphasis. And then it goes through a big cycle of doing heat pumps, and then it goes through another cycle of maybe it's high efficiency HVAC. So they tend to go through cycles, which is good and bad. Good because it gets the ball rolling, but what it means is that you can end up with contractors getting into doing heat pump hot water cylinders for 3 years, and then once the funding goes away, they haven't got a sustainable business model anymore, and so it can cause these boom and busts. So good and bad, and we've definitely seen, you can see the list of technologies that have been on the list previously and now have come off the list. And as you go through these hospitals, it's kind of like geology a little bit. As you go through, you can see the different layers of, they had, obviously at this particular year and time, they had a lot of installation of heat pump hot water cylinders, and now that funding's gone, and they're all from that period of 2008 to 2012, and then it's gone. And definitely an interesting learning, and it can cause some problems. And so thinking about how the policies are developed are very critical for ensuring long-term success of the technology.
So what is ECS pricing? Someone's asked the question.
Oh, the ETS, the emissions trading scheme.
ETS. Sorry, there you go. There we go. I think we're just gonna misheard. So look, I think we might wrap things up. But I think for me, I think it really comes down. I think we've really got 4 themes now, which is start early. Get a really good design. Think very carefully about what your initial thing is. Involve the local people from on the site. Buy local. Work with those local contractors. And don't chase the perfect. Something which everyone buys into, everybody can operate, everyone can see is going to work long term. Is far better than the fancy system implemented by these crazy guys in Christchurch or Brisbane. Anything else you guys want to add to those?
It's all good for me.
And it sums it up pretty well.
Well, look, thanks very much for joining, everyone. We're doing these almost on a weekly basis at the moment. So watch your email and watch your LinkedIn feeds, and we'll carry this on. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, David. Enjoy your weekends. See ya.
Yeah.
Cool.